This story I'm going to tell happened when I was 19 years old. My name is Julia. Today I'm 54 years old. At the time, she was engaged to Alonso, a boy who loved living life, a bit stubborn, who loved challenges. He even climbed Pico dos Marins in the city of Piquete in Sao Paulo, Brazil, with his hand fractured by a fall on the trail, but he was a person with a huge heart. When we found out about our pregnancy, we had the idea of taking a trip to celebrate the fact. We decided to spend a few days at an inn in the city of Jacarai in Sao Paulo. When we got there, we were received by Mr. Pedro, the owner of the inn, who lived there with his wife, appeared to be about 70 years old, and very nice. We settled in the very simple but very comfortable facilities, and that was what we wanted, as simple as possible. Arriving at night, we were already tired from the trip, and we were invited by Mrs. Maria, Mr. Pedro's wife, to join the table for dinner, a simple and delicious dinner, made with iron pots and a wood stove, everything we like. At a certain point, Alonso told Mr. Pedro that he had noticed a river on the road that passed close to the inn, and that it was a good place for fishing. Mr. Pedro looked at him with a sad look, and said that since he was a child he had not been near the banks of that river. Senor Pedro told us about an old legend from the region about a ghost boatman who appeared on the banks of the river and invited people to get on the boat to reach the other side. Legend says that he only said that, and that he never showed his face, but anyone who got on his boat disappeared into the river fog and was never seen again. But it seems like the legend of Sharon, said Alonso, being immediately silenced by me, because I didn't know the story and I was curious. But Alonso said he'd love to go fishing at night on the river, and if that boatman showed up he'd still ask for a ride to fish in the middle from Rio. Senor Pedro looked very sad and continued. When I was 8 years old, my grandfather, who already lived in the region, used to tell this story a lot. I was too afraid to go to the river, even during the day, even with someone else, but my father, who had problems with alcohol, didn't really like to hear it. Especially when I got home already a little high from drinking, and started making fun of my grandfather, saying that it wasn't this time that the boatman caught him. One night, he came home visibly upset, nervous, because he had lost money in card games and of course ingested a lot of alcohol. He started to argue with my grandfather, and at one point he challenged him. "What is it? Will you send your boatman to take me?" My grandfather told him to stop playing with those things. He, taken by anger and alcohol, said he would go to the riverside and call that boatman. He ran out staggering, mounted the horse and left for the road. My grandfather left behind and I fearfully ran after him. We mounted another horse, me on the back, and we left for the road, but the place on the bank was huge. It would be very difficult to locate my father. A heavy fog began to descend, and we started to gallop along the riverbank looking for my father. At a certain point, we found the horse that was with my father alone in the undergrowth. My grandfather began to get desperate, calling for my father. When we arrived in a clearing, we could see something that I never forgot. My father going up in a boat on the riverbank. The place was dark, but the moonlight allowed us to see that there was someone else in the boat, sitting with his head down. They seemed not to hear our screams. I remember seeing my father struggling to get on the boat and that motionless figure with his head down. They walked away until they disappeared in the fog. My grandfather in despair knelt on the grass and cried. When I was 8 years old, I was terrified, screaming for my grandfather to bring my father. The days passed. My grandfather became discouraged with life due to sadness, until he fell ill in bed, and from there he never left until he was taken away by God. Alonso and I looked at each other a little embarrassed. We thanked each other for dinner and went to bed. In the middle of the night, I woke up to go to the bathroom, but Alonso wasn't in bed. I looked around. I called and no answer. On the table I find a note. It was from Alonso. Dear, the story that Mr. Before we go back to our city, and don't worry, if the boatman shows up I know how to defend myself. I felt desperate. I don't even know if it was because of Senor Pedro's story, or fear of him going to an unknown place at night, where he could be attacked by an animal, and if it was actually a snake that dragged the grandfather of the Senor Pedro to the river. I ran desperately to Senor Pedro's door, pounding in despair. Senor Pedro opened the door scared, asking what had happened. I told him what Alonso had done. To my despair, Mr. Pedro couldn't disguise his nervousness and ran out of the house. He told me to wait there, that he would come with him soon. I didn't accept it and said that he wouldn't leave without me. We ran to an old jeep he had and we hit the road. On the way, he cried very nervously, and everything got worse when a heavy fog began to descend on the road. I even commented that if he had no flashlight he could get lost in the fog. Senor Pedro looked at the fog and only said, "This is not good, this is not good." In a certain stretch the jeep could no longer follow. We took flashlights and went along the bank looking for Alonso. When we arrived at a clearing, we focused our flashlights on something we saw on the bank, and I froze. I saw Alonso already inside a boat leaving. I started screaming desperately while Senor Pedro was petrified as if a childhood trauma had returned. And it had. Before they disappeared into the fog, I could still see Alonso looking in our direction. They disappeared. The day dawned and my despair increased. We called the authorities, who carried out searches all along the bank, and fire brigade boats traveled for kilometers along the river looking for something. But nothing, absolutely nothing was found. Some said that he could have been attacked by an animal, others that he was taken by the boatman. Time passed, days, weeks, months, and I always returned to that riverside in the hope of finding my fiancé. My sadness was so much that I had a complication during the pregnancy which caused me to lose my baby. That made me fall into depression. The only thing that made me leave the house was to go to that bank. The years passed. Mr. Pedro unfortunately died. His wife, with whom I formed a strong bond of friendship, invited me to live with her at the inn. I accepted, and every day, for months, years, I sat by the river and called out to Alonso. One late afternoon, as usual, I went to the bank and watched the river, imagining that at any moment Alonso would be returned to me. That day I ended up falling asleep on the riverbank. When I woke up at night, I was scared, but I knew that the inn would not be that far away and that a good walk would be there. But something was strange. A heavy fog began to descend, and at a certain moment I could see a boat already very close to me. A man sitting with his back, with his head down, said nothing. I got up scared, and with great difficulty I muttered, "You took him." The mysterious man pointed to the boat and said, "Get up, I'll take you to the other shore." I started to cry, and practically begged softly, "You took him, I just want him back. Give me back my fiancé. Give me back my Alonso, please." At that moment, the mysterious man raised his head and looked back. I had the biggest fright of my life. It was Alonso. He looked at me fondly and said, "Please go away. Please." I, crying, tried to get on the boat to hug him, but with his hand he made a gesture for me not to get on. When I got on this boat, the boatman who was driving it didn't show me his face. He just said to get on board, that he would take me to the other shore. I don't know how to explain the reason, but I got on the boat. When we arrived in the middle of the river, the fog dissipated a little and there was no shore. I was in the middle of a river at the same time in the middle of nowhere, and the boatman was no longer there. I tried to get out of the boat several times, but I couldn't. I can't explain. With overtime I realized that I would only get off the boat if someone got on board like I did and took my place. I don't know when my spirit will have peace. As long as someone doesn't accept to get on the boat, I will be trapped. So please go away. Take care of our son who will come. Crying, I explained that years had already passed, and that unfortunately we lost our baby. She could see a tear on the face of the boatman, who walked away until he disappeared in the fog. I sat on the bank and cried a lot. I walked back to the inn. Senora Maria was very worried. I told her what had happened. She cried and hugged me tightly. From that day on, I continued going to the riverside, but instead of crying, I talked. I took books where I spent whole afternoons reading aloud, because I knew that somehow he was there. He could hear me. To many a legend, a monster, a ghost; to me, my eternal bridegroom.